Geopolitics and Empire is joined by Scotsman David McCutchen, a man of many hats. We first met out in Kazakhstan, where we were both working for our boss, Nursultan Nazarbayev, at the Nazarbayev Intellectual Schools. He's now the leader of Restore Scotland, a Scottish political party which was founded in 2020 on the 700th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Arbroath. The party stands for the independence of Scotland, the liberty of the individual, the value and the autonomy of the family, the sanctity of human life, and the health and well-being of the people of Scotland. It's been a while, David. How is life in new normal Scotland?
We certainly have our challenges politically with the current scene, but life is good, and we're making a good start to things with the political party. We hope to really get a bit of traction over the coming years as we make the case for full independence for Scotland, both from the UK and from the EU.
All right. When I think of Scotland, people might laugh. What comes to mind immediately is the Highlander film and TV series, Sean Connery, The Color Green for some reason, kilts, tough bearded men, Game of Thrones, whiskey, and freedom. And it's funny, whiskey, you just told me you're also working in many industries. You're working in, you've got Hubmeyer, which is a e-commerce site, and in the field of whiskey as well. And you're, a politician now. And so, as I said, man of many hats. I unfortunately know little of Scotland, but I think this will be a great opportunity for myself and listeners to learn more. I was pleasantly surprised when I discovered you founded this new political party. It would be great if you could sort of give us a bit of a crash course, Scotland 101, and why you saw the need for a new political party and what problems exist in Scotland that need fixing, and what are the main issues right now on your radar, politically speaking, in relation to Scotland and your political party. A message from our sponsors. The Nomos app will help you survive COVID-1984 and the Great Reset. Nomos is a time bank that can be used by communities anywhere in the world. You just need to talk people into using it. For example, if you go to your barber for a 30-minute haircut, your barber receives 30 minutes in his time bank. He can then use that time to pay for an appointment with the doctor. I've spoken to the developer who is passionate about creating solutions for surviving and thriving in the apocalypse. Nomos is available in both English and Spanish. Hurry and visit nomos.net before they roll out the cashless society and put you in the algorithm ghetto. Also, if you need health insurance that covers you wherever you may roam, check out my friend James Guzman's Borderless Health Insurance. One of the great things about living internationally is saving money on health care, but private care overseas can be expensive. Go to borderlesshealthinsurance.com to watch a short presentation on expat and digital nomad healthcare and sign up for a free consultation to review your options. Geopolitics and Empire needs funding. You can leave a donation, book a consultation, or become a member, which gets you access to my brief weekly commentary, a monthly newsletter of my thoughts, a private telegram, a monthly members group call, and my second premium broadcast called Dissident Thinker, where I conduct interviews and provide solo analysis. Dissident Thinker is also available on Rockfin and for supporters on Locals.
So Scottish is a very ancient identity, and I think the Scottish national self-consciousness, even though we wouldn't necessarily have referred to it such 2,000 years ago, but it does date back to the Roman era. The Scots famously held back the Roman legions, and northern Scotland was one of the few parts of Western Europe that was never conquered. And if you read the speech of the earliest known Scot, a Celt by the name of Culgacus, which survives thanks to Roman historiography, you have this enormous and passionate plea for independence. And that's been a recurring theme in our history. Scotland fought numerous wars against the Vikings and against its neighbours. It has had a centuries-long desire to be more or less left in peace, allowed to do our own thing, allowed to be self-governing. That really fell apart in 1707 with the Act of Union, when the Scottish Parliament at that time agreed to go into a union between England and Scotland. And the politicians at that time that voted for Scotland to join with England subsequently were known as a parcel of rogues. There were very strong and credible accusations that they were essentially bought out. So Scotland and England's history in a far closer sense over the past 300 years has been interconnected, and Scots have obviously played a role in the British Empire, but that desire for independence never died away. In the 19th century, it really took the form of ecclesiastical disputes. So Scots were, for instance, at the forefront of resisting the spread of an English form of Episcopalianism called Anglicanism. Scots did a lot to make sure that they were able to choose their own ministers in the local kirks, and tried very hard to defend Presbyterianism in Scotland. You had a landowning class already by this time that was very much loyal to the English crown. And one of the things that we saw in the 19th century was, terrible clearances from the Highlands that you mentioned in your introduction there. And this is really stuck in the Scottish memory, the way in which, and currently I live on the edge of the Highlands. This is an area studded with little cottages and ruins where once there would have been thriving farms. And now it's barren and depopulated, and it's one of the legacies for us of the Union. So moving into the 20th century, you had the founding in 1933 of the Scottish National Party, the current party of government in Scotland. And they had basically almost like decades in the wilderness, making very little progress. But coming towards the end of the century, they started to really have an enormous breakthrough, culminating in a referendum in 2014 on Scottish independence, which sadly was narrowly lost. And following the referendum, you really had new leadership come into the SNP, new leadership that was maybe less concerned about independence, more bothered about the sort of like usual Western palette of woke issues and this sort of petty authoritarianism that we're seeing. You had a huge tranche of bills being pushed through the Scottish Parliament designed to restrict all sorts of liberties. A particular emphasis on speech. And recently we've had hate crime legislation that come through that has been widely criticised from all elements of Scottish society. Everyone has managed to unite the National Secular Society, the Roman Catholic Church, the Presbyterians came out and voted against the Law Society of Scotland. The civil society in Scotland is very strongly opposed to this. But there's a ruling faction around the current Scottish government that is frankly not particularly bothered by independence. They have other agendas, essentially trying to turn Scotland into the woker parts of California. And so that's what we're fighting against. The other major national conversation that we had in recent years was about Brexit, and if you take the Scottish ruling class, 120, for instance, if you look at the Scottish Parliament, 129 members of the Scottish Parliament, there's maybe one or two that weren't opposed to Brexit in the Scottish Parliament. It's the level of groupthink there is incredible. And if you go down the ranks in the SNP and the Scottish Greens, for instance, on the pro-Indie side, This makes no sense whatsoever, but on the pro-Indy side, we have almost uniform opposition to Brexit and almost uniform desire for an independent Scotland to rejoin the European Union. So on the one hand, they're making the case for national sovereignty to get out of the UK. On the other hand, they're making the case against it because they want to rejoin the EU, which is completely illogical. And the grassroots know it. And even in the SNP, which is an explicitly pro-EU party, about a third of the members voted for Brexit. So we are there to be that voice for true independence, for full national sovereignty for Scotland, not being beholden either to Westminster or Brussels.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on that. I had a question. Generally, I'm always in favor of independence, at the individual level and collective. My country, Croatia, became independent of Yugoslavia, but soon after we jumped, as you say, back into empire when Croatia joined the European Union. What we call Croatians, we call it Euroslavia. So we left Yugoslavia, we were free momentarily, and we jumped back into the frying pan into Euroslavia. I consider the EU to be an amalgamation of technocracy, Nazism, and the Soviet system. And I don't use that lightly. There are investigations by people like Dr. Rath, who says that the Brussels EU has its roots in 1940s Nazism. And we have Soviet dissidents. I think his name was Bukovsky, who called the EU the new European Soviet. And now we're seeing the technocratic aspect of it. So for me, the EU is a totalitarian construct, whichever way you cut it. And I found an article of yours in The National a year ago. You wrote, if elected, we will back efforts to pursue independence from the UK while completely opposing any policies that would surrender our newfound sovereignty as an independent Scotland to the institutions of the EU. As a party, we cannot see the merits of decoupling ourselves from one remote and elitist political institution only to weld ourselves to an even more remote and elitist one. In no way does this represent political independence, end quote. So, for you, what do you think? Right now, you guys are in the UK. What going forward, and this will take years, maybe decades, but what is the real possibility of Scotland breaking free from the UK and then being able to remain free from the EU? Because those are two different struggles as well.
Yeah, and they're different struggles in one sense. The first battle we only have to win once, in a sense, and I think if Scotland were to become independent, it would, at most, you would maybe have 15-20% of the voting population not being reconciled to that and wanting to re-enter the UK, at most. I think there's... it's interesting when I speak to folks on the unionist side in private conversation, folk are often already acknowledging that independence in some sort of medium-term horizon is practically an inevitability. That's not to say there isn't a major fight ahead of us. The question of then guarding that independence, well, that will become a generational struggle. And I don't think it's just necessarily a case of guarding our independence against the European Union. It's essential that we look to guard ourselves against any form of surrender of sovereignty to any multinational organization. There's risk in which Scotland could become a tool of NATO. I think if it was to rejoin the European Union, it's very likely that would come with re-entry into or entry into NATO. Our membership of NATO essentially was in some ways sort of grandfathered in as part of the process. Interestingly, the Scottish National Party's current position is that they would re-enter the European Union without a referendum. Now, that's interesting in a couple of senses. First of all, they're showing again that they have this a strongly authoritarian streak, anti-democratic. They're very afraid of the popular voice. But I think it's also, it reveals the fact that they are afraid they might lose. They will constantly repeat this statistic about, 2/3 of Scots voted against Brexit. But the question that was being asked in 2016 with regard to Brexit is a different one that will be asked in an independent Scotland. We won't be having a conversation about Brexit because we'll no longer be part of Britain. It'll be about whether we want to surrender that hard-won sovereignty. And what's interesting is the coalition that would oppose re-entry into the European Union. I know of and have met many figures across the political spectrum, from hard left to the right, who think that Scottish re-entry into the European Union would be a disaster. And I think that our political conversation is beginning to move on from this instinctive left-right paradigm, this way of viewing the world as battle between socialism and capitalism, to, I think, what is a truer reflection of the existential political struggle in the West at the moment, which is the dispute between nationalism and any form of defense of localism or, autonomy of people's self-determination and so on the one hand, and globalism on the other. So globalism has lots of power, lots of friends in high places, but if you really get down and engage with people on the grassroots, it's very, very few friends.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I wanted to go in different directions, but since you mentioned globalism, for me, we're now seeing it manifest itself very openly, because they can't, when you go open with the totalitarian system, you have to reveal your face. It's that for the longest time, it's been the velvet glove over the iron fist, and at some point that has to come off. And now we're witnessing this authoritarianism. You've alluded to it earlier with all over the Western world, this authoritarianism that's coming out. This, you called it petty authoritarianism, but it's steadily growing from free speech to all kinds of liberties we're losing. And now we see it manifest in the Great Reset, right? World Economic Forum, and all of what was previously, the secret Bilderberg meetings from 1954 and Trilateral Commission, and now they've gone full open with the World Economic Forum. And you have further thoughts on globalism and what's going on with Klaus Schwab and all of these things everyone's talking about now, the World Economic Forum.
I listen to Geopolitics and Empire all the time, and you've had guests on such as Patrick Wood that give the backstory really, really well. And I don't necessarily want to rehash all of that. I mean, Klaus Schwab's recent comments about sitting in the Canadian cabinet and half of these people were people we trained. I mean, it's so blatant, it's so obvious. I think so much of what was happening with COVID was very much like that as well. They're no longer hiding their intentions. Instead, they're trying to condition the population to get used to absurdities. They're trying to condition people to get used to the jackboot, the heavy hand of the state. And I think for me, the one message that I would really have definitely to your listeners, to people that get it, that see the big picture, is the importance of action and the importance of avoiding being trapped into a sort of cycle of fear. Don't become like a rabbit staring at a car headlights coming towards you. I think there's a tremendous amount that people can do, whether it's getting involved politically, writing, raising awareness locally, building networks, developing the sort of parallel economic structures that I think are really important for liberty. but people have to act. And I think that's one of the things that's really missing. And was part of the motivation for me getting involved in politics.
Yeah, and that goes back. I had the question then on Restore Scotland. If you could tell us, is it gaining traction? From what you were telling me, it seems there's a lot positive going for Restore Scotland. It's a long, hard road building a political party, but how is Restore Scotland doing?
Well, when we first launched, as you say, on the 700th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Arbroath. And our public launch was the following year, last year. We launched a few weeks before the election, and we got a lot of traction with some mainstream news outlets in the first weeks. And then everything came to a shuddering halt. Part of the reason was that the former First Minister for Scotland, Alex Salmond, who had been facing a sort of form of judicial persecution with interesting ties up into the Scottish establishment, launched the Alba Party at about the same time. Appears to have called round a number of the other minor parties and asked people to fold. So we never got the call, but we contested the election. We had, handful of candidates, only a few weeks to go. And actually, subsequently, following the election, we started to get that trickle of members coming in. But it is interesting the way in which, with the occasional exception as a minor party, the way you're controlled is basically by being ignored. And we have, for instance, just to give one example, our Wikipedia article, very well written, obeys all the rules about style and so on. That's essential for a Wikipedia article. As far as I could tell, looking at it, and whoever put it together, there was very little wrong with it. And all of a sudden, it's being speedily deleted. So that's an example of the sort of pressure that you have as a minor party. And one of the things that can lead to is minor parties taking kind of ridiculous stances, not doing the basics right of growing a political party, putting in the necessary infrastructure that you need. You need to make sure that you're ticking all the boxes as far as compliance, as far as, donations and so on. So my task and role, as I see it, as the first leader of the party, is really to put in place a really good foundation. And I'm sure we'll have other people coming into the party over the coming years that will be able to really take it on to the next level. It's a startup. It comes with all the challenges of a startup, the 80 hours a week, as you've referred to in the past. But I think we're starting to see that trickle of members coming through that gives us hope and optimism. The other decision that we've made in terms of the growth of this minor political party as it is at the moment is to build local networks and not to rely on technology. There is a way of growing a party where you basically you spend a lot of money with Facebook, you benefit from Facebook advertising, and that becomes a sort of virtuous cycle. But then you're dependent on them. You're dependent on all manner of apps and so on to grow your message. We do that, but the main focus of our activity as a minor party is local networks, local events, and building organically. And we believe that will be far more sustainable in the long term, because when our time as any not 100% pro-NATO parties, time will inevitably come. When our time comes to be deplatformed, we will have a network in place that will be able to survive that. And that's absolutely what we're all about.
Yeah, that's the best way of thinking. I do the same thing with Geopolitics and Empire. Why would I spend money on Facebook when Facebook restricts my page so no one can see my posts? It's nonsense. Reddit deletes my post. I just stopped using all of those platforms. I'm just building organically what we're doing on the podcast. And it's a longer road, but it seems to be working thanks to listeners sharing the podcast and material. Just quickly on Brexit, I just wanted to comment, so they've left the EU. But soon after, we saw Britain discussing joining NAFTA, or what is now known the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, NAFTA 2.0. For me, NAFTA is the foundation of the North American Union, and this was a red flag for me. It immediately made me think of, the 1939 globalist plan known as the Atlantic Union. So in 1939, this union, the plan was to create a supranational regional economic political union called the Atlantic Union, which would begin with U.S., Britain, and Canada, joining into a regional union. And so it's funny now that Britain leaves the EU, and they were discussing joining the North American, union, which I'll call, which initially was like knocked off. But what are your thoughts, just briefly, on what will happen to Britain now that it's outside of the EU? Is it just going to stay as it is, or you see them trying to push to join the U.S., Mexico, Canada agreement? What's going to happen there?
It was definitely amongst Brexit campaigners, there was definitely an Atlanticist element. There were those that saw Brexit as an opportunity to really strengthen and deepen transatlantic ties, including on trade. So Daniel Hannan, for instance, a really good example of someone that favours a far stronger relationship there. The idea of joining pact like that is just essentially to turn the British Isles into Airstrip 1, that idea from the Orwell novel that we would just become this sort of outpost of the greater Americas, whatever. So I think it's very much against the spirit of Brexit. In some ways, Boris Johnson has been a colossal disappointment to the Conservatives. He's not really sort of knuckled down and tried to make the best of Brexit. He's not tried to, he's tried but not been particularly successful in forming trade deals with the economies and the countries that matter. And particularly the failure to get a deal with the United States, I think, is very telling. He may very well have managed had President Trump been re-elected. But President Biden is very, very strongly opposed to any sort of sense of the spirit of Brexit being rewarded. So, and one of the sort of weird dynamics that's at play at the moment is the Euro-Atlanticists in the UK are just going absolutely out of their way to show that they're more war hawkish even than the State Department. They're sort of going into we had, for instance, just earlier on today, we had Ben Wallace, the UK Defence Secretary, saying that the UK was going to give, and I quote, give Russia a kick up the backside or kick them out of Crimea. It's extraordinary language to use. He was specifically brought in the Scots Guard, which is unfortunate, but he sort of said, well, we did it back in the time of the Crimean War, we're going to do it again. And interestingly, again, from a Scottish perspective, the SNP is totally dominated by these Euro-Atlanticists. The defence spokespeople, the sort of miniature foreign and defence policy establishment within the Scottish National Party wants hard and fast re-entry, not only into the European Union, but also into NATO.
Before asking you about Ukraine, so you and I both lived in Kazakhstan, and we knew interesting people. We've talked to people in government there in Kazakhstan, and the precursor to what's happening in Ukraine was, I think, first what happened in Kazakhstan in January. I think there are links between what's going on, and just what are your thoughts on what happened in Kazakhstan?
It's very difficult looking at the situation from the outside to know exactly the causes. I think there's certain things that we can see about the outcome and the results. There has been a bit of a changing of the guard. It would seem as though there's an effort to show that there's a degree of continuity from the Nazarbayev regime. But if you look, if you follow Kazakh news media, there's almost daily announcements about folks being fired and hired and so on. There will be obviously the trial of Karim Masimov, and I guess we would expect more to come out about that. And there's a Kazakh political scientist that was reading earlier on that was suggesting that the narrative developing around Masimov was that they became aware of a plot, a sort of color revolution type plot, to overthrow the Nazarbayev regime. And rather than trying to prevent it, just let it happen. So Masimov was head of the KGB, the Kazakh KGB at the time. So I think we'll, maybe a few years from now, a little bit further from the event as testimonies come out about those times, we'll start to build up a sort of better picture of what happened. I know there are other versions out there that it was a fake coup. Is one of the ones that's doing the rounds. I think that's pretty close to what you saw in Turkey 5 or 6 years ago. I think that's probably a good explanation as to what's happened. The interesting thing, of course, is Tokayev has specifically said that there was foreign involvement. But what hasn't happened yet, and I think this would be really interesting, is for Tokayev or others within the Kazakh security apparatus to actually come out and say which foreign powers specifically were involved. Because until they do that, it's just rhetoric. But if they actually come out and say this was, say, for example, the Turkish or the Kyrgyz or Uzbek forces behind it, the UK's been implicated, some have said the US. Those are all strictly just for example, but until he actually does that, until he actually comes out and says, here's the foreign powers that were behind it, here's the evidence, then, as I say, we're kind of none the wiser.
All right. And what are your thoughts? What's going on with Ukraine and the wider geopolitical picture of US, EU, Russia, China?
Well, what times we're living in is, as the old Chinese curse goes, may you live in interesting times, right? I think the Ukraine has been appallingly badly let down by the West. It's basically been used as a source of sort of dodgy funding for significant Western politicians, and culminating in essentially, there's no other way to describe what happened in 2014 but a coup. And at the same time, of course, I don't agree with, maybe a certain strand of thought within the sort of Eurasianist community that would say, oh, Ukrainian, it's not a real people. They don't have their own, right to self-determination and so on. They clearly do, and there are many, and as a national movement seeking self-determination, we have a lot of sympathy for Ukraine in that. I think Ukraine continuing to take steps that provokes Russia is a path that is fraught with difficulties. And the biggest difficulty is it's not clear from all the highfalutin rhetoric that the Western powers are actually going to do anything. They haven't said they're going to, in any serious way, consider admission of Ukraine into NATO. And they're putting token numbers of troops into Ukraine. So they're basically letting Ukrainians get on with it. At the same time, they are acting in a way as to provoke and aggregate, really wind up the Russians. I think Russia has genuine security concerns with regard to the expansion of NATO. All of this is just deeply tragic. We could, the West and Russia had, a once in a lifetime opportunity in the 90s to start rebuilding. I think that the fact that Russia has taken a more socially conservative line is a major under-discussed piece of the picture. For me, the transition within, say, the US State Department that took place happened not in 2014, but in 2013, as it became clear that Russia wasn't on board with the woke agenda. I think that what we're likely to see is a lot of NATO huffing and puffing, a lot of provocation of Russia, but very little real help on the ground for the Ukrainians. Ukraine is basically treated as a sort of putative battlefield, and it is there's been very little encouragement for Ukraine to actually take the sort of steps that would help it normalize its relations with Russia and to rebuild there. Obviously, there's responsibility on the Russian side as well. I think the Russian concerns, however, about the expansion of NATO are justified. And certainly this talk about self-determination and so on that we've seen in recent days is so hypocritical. It's like one law for Kosovo and another for Lugansk and Donetsk. So this is the game NATO has chosen to play. George Kennan was entirely right in all of his warnings. I think a far better security solution for the countries of Eastern Europe would have been if they had formed their own regional security alliance. But the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe, more or less essentially surrounding Russia, has been a bit of a disaster. And we're bearing the consequences. And you now have an incredible degree of belligerence, not just from the unionist politicians here in Scotland, but also from the establishment Scottish National Party, who are dominated by a Euro-Atlanticist wing. And at Restore Scotland, we would like to put forward a different vision for what security could look like in an independent Scotland. So essentially, this is not official party policy, but it's always been my position that we would hold out for a form of neutrality, maybe perhaps a pragmatic neutrality, in the sense that we would obviously work together with other countries if we were ever faced with an imminent threat. But an independent Scotland should be out of NATO. It should stay outside of the European Union, and it should be a voice, hopefully, of sanity and a voice for peace in the world.
My last question then would be, I was thinking of a recent interview with Johnny Vedmore talking about the Great Reset, and he's not a Christian, but he was saying that he talks to a lot of people who think that we could potentially be looking at some type of biblical type apocalypse. So we're having a lot of secular people talking about, the book of Revelation. And then I have guests on, such as yourself, who's a Christian, or Patrick Wood, who's a Christian, or others, Jim Jatras as well, who I've interviewed. Are we living in, as John from Patmos described, the end times? We've got, the Great Reset, the World Economic Forum, global government, dystopian. We've got the powder keg of future possible, global war. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think biblical prophecy is absolutely fascinating. It's well worth looking into, even if you're not a Christian. And the prophecy is about the second coming, essentially, the end of the world, the last days, however it's referred to are concrete, and they're comprehensible, and they're comprehensive, and you can find them both in the Old and New Testament. And from a geopolitical perspective, one of the interesting things about them is that there's definitely a sense with biblical prophecy that at the end, everything becomes global. I mean, there's this constant reference to all people, all nations, and so on. There's talk of a global currency system, which is something that would be hard to imagine, 1,000 or even 2,000 years ago. There are lots of there's references, for instance, to hyperinflation. So there are lots of very specific events that are referred to that couldn't have happened at some time in the past, and now can. References to the State of Israel and so on. So, I mean, I think it certainly seems as though, if you want to take the obstetric analogy, it seems as though we're full term. Maybe there's the beginnings of some form of birth pangs. But another interesting observation that I would have about that is it is becoming this sort of theme that people are picking up, even people who are not of faith or not of the Christian faith anyway. But one of the things that I've noticed is that people are maybe suggesting that some form of self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, personally, that's nuts. I mean, no Christian would want to precipitate a time of trouble that's described as worse than any time in human history. Nor would any non-believer, I think, want to precipitate events that would confirm the biblical prophecies. Instead, I think it's up to us to look at them, to take them seriously, the predictions in Scripture, and follow the warnings.
Yeah, there's a handful of people who have this extreme posture that, there's a group of people today using the Bible as sort of a playbook. And for me, that's the complete inverse of the understanding that this was predicted, let's say, by God, what would happen. Like, this was going to happen. He kind of laid out, okay, this is going to happen. It's not the reverse where people are using it as a playbook. That's why it's called a prophecy. So any final thought for us then?
Well, if the first thing to say, obviously, is if you're living in Scotland or you have a connection to Scotland, as I said at the beginning, it's really important people don't hope. And one of the ways that you can do that is by acting politically. If you're not in Scotland or you don't have any connection to us, then find ways of getting involved politically, locally. Most parties are a small team of volunteers and enthusiasts. You can make a huge difference, and we would really encourage people, if you share our skepticism about global government and the European Union, if you share our skepticism about trying to find, these broad overarching solutions for all of humanity, if you really believe in the local, if you believe in autonomy, if you believe in national self-determination and sovereignty, get involved in politics, make a difference, be heard. So, and for those of your listeners that are in Scotland, or as I say, have a connection to Scotland, restorescotland.org is where we're at. And we've got a big announcement coming up in the next couple of weeks. We are planning to change the party name to Sovereignty. This was a popular initiative amongst the members of the party. So as of a couple of weeks from now, will be Sovereignty, and you'll be able to find us at sovereignty.scot. For the time being, if you go to restorescotland.org, you'll be able to follow what we're up to.
Great. I was just going to ask you that question: where would be the best place to find you? And there you have it. All right. It's always great catching up with you, David. I wish Restore Scotland or Sovereignty great success. If I were Scottish, I would be voting for your party. Thank you for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list that goes out with each podcast and every weekend with a collection of news headlines. The newsletter and website are our last lines of defense. We're being censored and deplatformed. It's nearly impossible to find Geopolitics and Empire on the Google search engine. We've been blacklisted. YouTube frequently takes down our videos with strikes. Facebook restricts our page. Reddit and Twitter take down posts. And after the Associated Press mentioned Geopolitics and Empire in a 2021 article co-written with NATO, our Patreon account was terminated. Vimeo also terminated our Pro account. The best free way to help Geopolitics and Empire is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or elsewhere and subscribe to all of our media channels. You can find the video broadcast now on 5 platforms: Odyssey, Rockfin, Rumble, BitChute, and Brighteon. You can find the audio broadcast on the podcast ecosystem: SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, and so on. My current favorite social media channels are Twitter and Telegram, but you can also find us on Gab, MeWe, Minds, Float, VK, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Finally, Geopolitics and Empire is in dire need of funding to continue. You can leave a donation, purchase a consultation with the host, or become a member to receive additional benefits. We also produce a weekly broadcast called Dissident Thinker for members and Rockfin subscribers only. We will continue to fight the good fight come hell or high water. Thank you for listening.